Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Thank you all for joining us in this special edition. I'm with my dear friend, Max Falkowitz, fellow author.
Hi, everybody.
Max is the author of Leafhopper, a much more popular subscription newsletter about tea than Tea Technique. And Max and I have been friends for a while now. And Max having a history as a professional reporter and a background in journalism, we thought it'd be fun to sit down, have some tea, and talk about what we see in the industry.
It's great to be here with my teaware rabbi, who has taught me how little I know about everything regarding ceramics. It's great to chat here, and thanks for that very kind introduction. Leafhopper is a weekly newsletter about tales from the tea world from a somewhat eclectic perspective. I try to explore the business side, culture, history, the biology of tea, the psychology of how it works with us. The stuff that the way I tried to describe it when I first launched it a year ago was this is going to be a home for the tea stories that are too niche or weird for the editors that I work with to ever accept and publish. So this is going to be a place for tea people to get something more real from my journeys through traveling around to tea regions and talking with producers and sellers and folks like yourself who are incredible experts in what you do. And I often tell people that the job of a journalist is to be professionally annoying, where you have to just put yourself in front of people and ask them all sorts of questions. And if they don't answer you, it's a First Amendment violation. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be annoying with you here today.
Well, usually I'm on the other side of the table asking 100 questions of our friends in China, Yisheng makers, tea makers. So we have very different readerships. When you say journalism about tea, you actually mean professional journalism. You've been on trade junkets, you have done articles for Savoir magazine, you've been published in a number of places. This isn't just an online publication.
Yeah. So my background, I've worked in digital media, digital food media, food and travel for the past 10 years or so. I was an editor at Serious Eats several corporate owners ago. And then I was at Savoir magazine running the digital side of their publication. And that's where I was able to get a trip to Yunnan to do a story about pu'er tea there with our mutual friend, Paul Murray. And for the last 9 years, I've been a freelance hired gun for the New York Times, Bon Appetit, Wall Street Journal, tiny little zines, websites around the web, and all sorts of different places doing stories, not just about tea, but also about how food and culture shape our behavior and our understandings of the world around us. And tea has been a particularly interesting subject, in part because there aren't that many people doing it in the bigger journalistic world. And my personal bugaboo is that, and I think you've probably found this with the wine writing that you've dug into, a lot of it is just really boring. And it doesn't, there are incredible stories to be told about parts of the world that very few people have access to. And we have the astounding fortune of being able to go into these communities and be professionally annoying. And we can tell these stories to people that give a whole different sense of magic and perspective and visceral excitement about these things that are very consequential and very important to people and very important to us. And then for the past year and change, most of my tea writing has been on Leafhopper, going after a weirder sort of audience. The media marketplace hasn't been a very comfortable environment for the last few years. So I think it's incumbent on people who have something to say to find their own way to say it outside of the necrotic media sphere. And I have a lot of optimism about indie publications like Tea Technique that are able to reach very targeted audiences and deliver something that nobody else can, because it doesn't matter really how large your audience is. It matters what your impact is for the people that care about your stories. And from where I sit, I've never gotten more reader mail than for really niche small stories that really capture people's attention. And I'm curious what people are responsive to in the stories that you do and the way that you approach the books. And maybe this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I'm interested to know what is affecting people from the work that you do, and how are you seeing some of the impact of the work that you're doing out there? And that's putting you on the spot. See if I'm answering that right.
Before I answer that, let's drink some tea.
We have tea.
Yeah.
Tell me what's happening here.
So we have actually pulled out a pretty special tea for this conversation for our first tea of the day, first tea of the evening. This is
For the benefit of the audience, this conversation began at 1 a.m. last night by text of what tea should we be drinking, which was wonderful to receive.
Yeah. Just in case, you had strong opinions or strong thoughts on any of the recent trip reports. We just published the Yiwu and the Wuyi trip reports, which I'm sure is going to generate a whole lot of conversation. This tea is from the Yiwu trip. So this is Sheng pu'er. It is, as you can see, it's loose leaf. Some people would call it Mao Cha. That's neither here nor there. It is Sheng. It is a 30 to 50-year-old tree on the west side of Gaoshanjai. And this is planted tea. So it is not plantation, but it is not totally wild. This tea was actually planted as someone's dowry. And so it was gifted to the bride and groom on their wedding from the family so that they would have something to harvest and pick and call their own.
And is it growing in someone's backyard, or is
No, it's still deep forest. Everything Yiwu, Gaoshanjai is all, there's some village tea, but you walk another 15 minutes and you're in pretty deep forest. That might not be true forever. Unfortunately, the road is going to Gaoshanjai. That's where they're building the terminus of the highway now leading into the mountains. But part of what's special about this tea, it is deep forest. It is very natural environment. It is not Gushu, which is, the first bit of bragging that everyone does about their pu'er. But the other thing that's special about this is actually the tea that I made this year.
Because you and your travel companions were each processing the same leaves, but you were each kind of doing it your own
100% by hand. Yeah, targeting the same things with instruction from the same family. But Pat is very strong. He's benching like 350 or something right now. I am not quite that strong. And so, they told us you can't overroll your tea. And then Pat managed to overroll his tea. I have hands of steel, so I didn't shy away from the extreme heat of wok. Zongjin's batch got a little co-opted. We had some external friends show up that wanted to help. There's a fun story about that we spoke about. But yeah, it was shocking how different this tea was from each of us. And it was also shocking the idea that this tea is actually going to slowly turn into more and more of the same. It's going to lose much of that early differentiation, and it's going to revert kind of to its natural targeted flavor. And that's specifically because it's good tea. I wouldn't call ourselves the best processors. They shouldn't give us any, danju. But the tea itself is very good tea. We didn't make any mistakes in its processing. And so over the next 15, 20 years, this tea, despite there being strong differences that we can taste today, it's actually going to converge.
No, when you talk about differences in the processing, what were those differences in terms of how you were handling the leaf?
Mine was most in the middle. So Zongjun wound up doing the lightest roll and the lightest shaching, which he should be embarrassed about because my wrists and thumbs are both sprained from rock climbing. Pat, being the strongest of us, did the hardest roll, and his leaves spent the most time in the wok, and then mine was somewhere in between. And so Zongjun's a little more greener, fresher, a little more of that lighter, immediate floral aroma. And you can kind of taste it here. There's a hint of verdant greenness in this tea. I mean, this is less than a year old, right? This is only a couple months old. But Pat's tea is going to have more of a cooked, steamed flavor. It's going to be a little bit sweeter, a little bit less bitter. So the differences were relatively minor. We're talking about a minute or two here or there. We're talking about a slight shift in heat management. We're talking about a couple more minutes or a couple more seconds of rolling, right? So these weren't massive differences that mean a tea is flawed or bad, but they are enough that we can really taste how different they turned out.
In the trip report, the way you described it was almost like the tea was going to age into what it was destined to become.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what are the factors that are determining that destiny? Because when we talk about aging in the Western poor world, it seems that mostly we're talking about differences in storage environments and different microclimates, but that wasn't really the focus of what you were discussing. And I'm curious to see what you see as the main determining factors for the aging trajectory of teas like these.
Yeah, that's a big question. That'll probably be many chapters in the book. I think people have gotten better at understanding what it is that's actually going on, but they've also become better at mythologizing. So humidity is important. Your storage environment for the tea is important. If you store your tea totally sealed, it's going to taste different than if you store it in a humidified environment or a heated environment, or if you have natural storage, right? If you're in Guangzhou and could just leave the tea in ambient, it's going to taste quite different. I do think that humidity makes positive impact, right? I'm using cigar humidifiers, and these are humidity controlled and monitored, but they're not externally heated. I think that the diurnal temperature changes and the seasonal temperature fluctuations are quite good for the tea. And there is active microbial growth. You see online people saying, mold alert, there's white fuzz on the tea. Like, yeah, if you're looking for active microbial fermentation, right? Secondary metabolite breakdown. If you're looking for changes over time, that's what you should expect.
Everyone says they want organic, totally natural products until there's any kind of variation that looks the slightest bit suspect.
Yeah. And I've had way overly wet stored teas that have a storage flavor, moldy flavor. Thankfully, not in my collection, but traveling around. And thankfully, sometimes they blow off, right? Just like a wine, you open a wine and it's catty and you wait a little bit or decant it and it blows off. In a rinse, it comes off, or in the first brew, it comes off. And I've had other teas that are permanently damaged. But the things that are really important is you're never going to take a bad tea and turn it into a good tea with aging. Or you have to start with something good. Now, what does that mean, start with something good? This is where people get into all sorts of what I call merchant myths, right? Some people say it was really only the factory blends that were ever made for aging. And other people say, no, it was the deep forest, totally wild, mythical pre-ROC Yiwu tea or masterpiece era Hongyan was actually a blend of multiple areas, or it was a full blend, multiple Yiwu areas that ages, right? Or that teas from this area age and teas from that area don't, or the claim that Jingmai teas need sealed storage and Yiwu and Menghai teas need humidified storage. There's all sorts of things, but the reality is that this idea of fully single origin boutique style production pu'er is relatively new. And so, part of the idea is that no one actually knows. And I think that so much of the ideas that come to us, particularly in the West, they are, if anything, I would say they are overactive, right? Like very few people with a wine collection are going to be going in and adding heat mats and adjusting things, or you don't rotate the bottles over time.
It seems like there's a lot of superstition over trying to find control and having these superstitious rituals that give you a sense of control, even if you don't necessarily know where the tea is going to go. Because something that I try to talk about on Leafhopper is similar to what you were just bringing up now about what are often considered the barometers of quality tea. Like this tree is from this, from this tree. This tea is from this tree that's this many years old. These are numbers that sound quantifiable, and they don't require you to be on site. They don't require you to have any particular firsthand experience with the tea, but it's a number that you can deal with, and that makes you feel like you know something. And the longer I drink tea, the more it seems to me, and this seemed like it was getting that you were hinting at this. There's an aroma here. There's a pickled mustard aroma that brings me right back to that noodle place that we were eating a few years ago. Yeah, in a very pleasant way. It feels very nostalgic. That, what am I trying to say? I think that, yeah, absent, in the West, this is a product that's being consumed with no access to its point of origin.
Yeah.
And so we're going off of whatever scraps of information that we have.
Yeah.
And we are desperate to make sure that this investment of tea that we're aging will continue to taste good. And we're just sort of grasping at straws for what we can control, regardless of what we actually know of whether it will control or not.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And something that I've written, I think a lot about is that the access that we have here in the West is quite limited. There's more access than there's ever been before, and there's a broader idea and a broader understanding of quality. Part of the problem is that no one really has the correct references or enough references or trustable references for quality. And because of that, you get into a situation where it's easy for someone to believe that they know something that, okay, I've had, Gaogan Gushu Danju from Mahe. Like, probably not. I mean, you've had something, right? But even in China, something like that would be very difficult to buy. And the people who do just spend money and buy it without a deep understanding and relationship with the makers, without the people who have access to that type of tea. If you rock up to Yiwu and you walk into a random tea maker's studio or house and you're like, hey, I need some Gaogan Gushu Danju, they're going to sell you something, right? And it might actually be a Danju. If you stick around, you spend long enough, you say, I'm going to watch this production, right? This is my production I'm going to watch. They'll go out and they'll pick a tree. Maybe they know that tree. Maybe they don't know that tree. Maybe they think that tree is good. Maybe they think that tree is not that good, right? But there's a lot of trees that get made into Danju just because of demand that shouldn't be made into Danju. And so now you have two things going on. One, you have people calling Dashu Gaogan, right? And Dashu, Gaogan should technically always forever be Gushu. But there's many Gushu trees that don't get that big.
The Gaogan trees are the tall, narrow trees that grow in dense canopies instead.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And most of them, the ones that get the name, the one that deserve the name, are Gushu trees. But many Gushu trees don't grow that tall, and some other trees get lucky. You can easily have a 50-year-old tree that is tall and thin, and that's going to get sold as Gaogan, and it may or may not be Gushu. And it may or may not be worth making into Danju. And so on one side, you now have definitional drift, right? People abusing terms for marketing. Okay, there's demand for Gaogan. Now we need more Gaogan trees. Now all these trees that are tall and look good in photos, these are now all Gaogan. That's on one side. On the other side, you have individuals who are making blended Danju. Danju literally means single tree. And now they're going to say, this is a 3-tree blend Danju. This is a 4-tree blend Danju. And on one side, some of those trees need it. Some of those trees don't have independently a complex enough flavor profile to warrant making a Danju. But on the other hand, it's not Danju, right? That's a select pick blend, which is still an amazing thing, right? If you offer me deep forest select pick Gushu, I might be very excited about that. But when you then abuse a term to say it's a 4-tree blend Danjus, okay, what are we making up for with this abuse of terms for marketing?
And that abuse can happen at any point along the supply chain, right? That can be between the producer and the initial buyer, or the vendor that's selling it to the final customer, or anywhere in the middle.
Yes. And things get modified, things get exaggerated. The reality is very few people actually know what they have, particularly if they're buying in enough bulk to sell. So much of the best tea is never pressed in cakes. It's never wrapped. There's no markings on it. You can't track it. If you're a very wealthy tea person in China who knows something, right? Not just someone who is willing to spend money on a fancy brand of tea, but someone who actually, the fellow cha ren at the upper end of the income scale in China, you're just going to be in private WeChat groups where these types of things are offered. You have friends who go to Yunnan every year, friends who have been buying for 15, 20 years now. And that's, just as an example, right? Some of the nicest tea that I have is going to, just loose leaf in a bag. The only marking is my own handwriting, right? This is not something that you can really just buy, right? You have to be in the right place at the right time in order to grab it at the right price, because it's not going to stick around. Right. It's not like people are hoarding this and saying, guess what? We can sell this on the Western market.
Right. And this happens in every specialty food situation. A few years ago, I was in Andalusia reporting on the jamón ibérico production universe, which has similarly a lot of myth making in it. But one of the treats of being there at origin is there's a lot of Iberico fresh pork meat that's not used for charcuterie that you can get in local restaurants.
Yeah.
And it's delicious and it's very full flavored. It's not super fatty. It doesn't have the kind of heaviness of Wagyu, but it has that really melt in your mouth quality from all the unsaturated fat. And that's kind of how it should be. You know, if you live in the area where these things are produced, you get access to special things because you're a part of that community. And I think it's very easy for Western tea drinkers to remember that we're not the target, or it's very easy for Western tea drinkers to forget that we're not the target audience.
Yeah.
And we can benefit from this indigenous farm product that has brought in recent years great wealth to some of these communities. But the traditions of tea making and the reasons that people make teas in the ways that they do often have very little to do with taste or refined access to the best thing for the highest paying customer.
Yeah.
What greater flex is there as a farmer than to give some of the best tea that you have to your friends who couldn't afford to buy it?
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that happens frequently is, you know, prices go up almost every year, particularly at the top end of the tea market. They'll go up every year. But people think, oh, okay, you know, maybe I'll just outspend them. But they're not going to sell it to you, because if someone's been buying from them and keeping up with the price increases for the last 5 years, 10 years, and you come up and you're like, I'll pay you double. Are you going to do that next year? Are you going to do that every year for the next 10 years? Probably not. So why would they burn a repeat customer, someone who they have a relationship with, who's probably turned friends onto them, who's probably promoted them within their own high income private tea drinking circles, for someone who's going to do a one-off, pay double or whatever? It's just not how it works.
Yeah. I'm spacing out for a minute because the tea just kind of hit me with this wall of peaceful warmth down the back of my head, down my back. And I have a very loose understanding of what Yiwu tea means, but this kind of peaceful feeling is reminiscent of some of the better Yiwu experiences that I've had. But in your trip report, you took pains to point out that Yiwu can mean all sorts of different things. And even in this one tea, you can have 3 very different impressions of it from just who's processing it. How much do these appellations matter to you as a tea drinker outside of if you're just drinking a tea for your own enjoyment? How much do you care about those appellations?
Well, this is such a good question, but it's also so hard to answer with the right level of nuance. There's going to be, you could almost certainly tell blind, again, talking about good quality tea, not random purchases, not things that are claimed to be stuff, right? But talking about the upper, say, 80th percentile, top 20% of the tea market, top 10% of the tea market, you can immediately tell a Jingmai from a Menghai, from a Linsong, from a Yiwu. But can you then, within those areas, begin to identify? Really, probably only for some of the most famous areas. I mean, if someone hands you a random red wine, maybe you can say, okay, this tastes Spanish, this tastes Italian, this tastes French. But can you say this, you know, this tastes like left bank Bordeaux or right bank, you know, Bordeaux? Maybe not. It's much, much harder to do. So, and there's fractal complexity within it, right? So you say, okay, Northern Rhone, Southern Rhone, and you say it's Northern Rhone. So is it Châteauneuf du Pape? Is it Domaine Telegraph and Châteauneuf du Pape? So you can go, there's just this fractal level of complexity. So within each area, if you were to say, you know, say Mahe is pretty central to Yiwu. Okay, there's roadside, village side Mahe tea. There's forest tea, there's deep forest tea, and then there's sub-appellations, right? Luo Shuidong and Shimen Kan are either within Mahe or have been carved out of Mahe. And those are considered to be superior areas to things that are simply labeled Mahe. Now, do I have an idea of what those should taste like? Only from the families who I work with directly. And even those families don't make teas the same way. One of the most interesting things about being in Yiwu and working with multiple families is the side sniping. I've tried their tea, right? It tasted a little Yesheng, tasted a little Big Tree, or that was all right, but it's not a real Gaogan. Or their trees were pollarded in the late 90s. So there's all this idea of,
And how much of that is the taste versus using tea as a substrate for settling whatever scores people have between each other in the village?
that's a good question. The tea families don't seem to have too much of that type of conflict, partially because of intermarriage, partially because of the complex webs of familial relationships and trade relationships. There's not like the cattiness that there is for Longjing or Wuyi areas. There's much less of that. And pu'er and Yiwu itself are just so much bigger when the best tea is all wild, semi-wild tea. So you don't really get that type of score settling, but you do get really strong preferences on production styles and who has actual shaching and wok skills, production skills. And you do get a lot of side commentary. There's this whole internal debate about what tea is good tea at the tree level. And there's a really strong belief by some families that Yesheng is bad, that wild tea is bad flavor, bad representation of pu'er, and bad for you. I'll go as far to say, oh, wild tea is poisonous, which is where you get that.
And is that because they don't own wild tea trees?
No, it's even more confusing than that. When they say wild tea trees, they actually mean wild cultivar. All of those top end families have seed grown, what we consider wild tea. But when they say it, they mean wild cultivar tea. So wild cultivar tea is the tea that grows the giant trunks and has that wilder, gamier flavor that some areas, particularly things that are labeled Goyolin, the national forest tea, is known for. But there's other tea within Goyolin that doesn't have that flavor. And they'll tell you, the families that care a lot about this, which is, I guesstimate it's like half and half. Half the families are like, no, that the Yesheng flavor is great. And I wrote in the trip report, I love the Yesheng flavor. I have a non-exclusive preference for it. This tea is the opposite of that. This is not super wild forest tea, but this has none of that flavor versus other teas that do. And they'll tell you that's either pure Yesheng or hybridized with Yesheng. So it would kind of be like going to areas in France that have strict laws around which grape varietal. And then you go to an area that's only supposed to be growing Syrah and someone's growing an indigenous small cultivar. Then I guess that happens more in Italy. Like we was in Brisghelia, famous for its olive oil, and there's great wines in Emilia Romagna. Some of the areas there, DOCs have strict grape regulations, although Italy has mostly loosened them to allow for any indigenous grapes to a region to be grown. And there's only 2 fields growing Centissimo, an indigenous grape from that area, and it's the only places that you can get it. So it's kind of like that, but then having the DOC saying this is not representative of the region. You shouldn't be growing this. You shouldn't be making this. And other people saying, what do you mean? It's wild. It's indigenous. It should be here. It's part of the land.
And if you're interested in single origin teas that reflect where they came from, you kind of have to take the bad with the good because you're tasting the land. The tea is acting as almost like a solvent for the environment, and you're capturing that flavor, and that's just what it is.
Yeah, I should, it's so hard to formulate this in a way that makes sense. I think there might be some truth to the criticisms about Yesheng cultivar. There might be some truth to the idea that that humans spent hundreds of years breeding the tea away from that profile, reducing those compounds that they believe are unhealthy, cultivating tea into something that you can eat.
You're tasting a selective breeding program
Yeah.
of generations.
Yeah.
And it's been intentionally manipulated to yield a predictable and pleasant character.
Yeah, exactly. And so the difference between, say, ages are all relative, but a 200-year-old Yesheng tree and a 200-year-old not Yesheng, but still seed-grown Qidong, wild but not wild cultivar tea. Some families are going to say one is better, and other families are going to say another is better. And there's good arguments to both sides. The best argument, if I was going to strongman this, to steel man it, would be that it's like carbonic maceration in wine or natural production in coffee. Are there good natural coffees? Absolutely. Do those natural coffees reflect the local flavor of the land? In some ways, and not in others. Carbonic maceration also covers up a lot of terroir. That's my steelman argument. I don't fully believe that, and I still do drink Yesheng variety teas and enjoy them. But one of the families that we work with in Yiwu is very strongly against them.
Yeah, and this is something that I've noticed from interviewing a lot of growers of a lot of different things. All farmers have very strong opinions, and sometimes they're wrong. And that's okay,
Yeah.
because they're really good at growing tea and making tea, even if they aren't the person that you want to trust as the appraiser of something.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
that's okay too.
Or they're good at growing that thing on their land and their environment with their production techniques. Yeah, I entirely agree with that.
It's so easy to reduce farming to a set of predictable inputs, but until you're growing stuff on the land and you have to deal with seasonal variations in rainfall and exactly what your soil is and whatever pests are, you just have no idea. And it's kind of a miracle that it works out as well as it does. And it's a testament to the work that people do to make it that way. But I wanted to ask you about these growing conditions more generally, because we're getting really in the weeds on wild strains of individual tea trees. The deep forest environment, describe what that's like for someone who hasn't been in a pu'er tea forest.
Yeah, the beauty and the remoteness and the sheer wildness of Shishwambana is hard to communicate. Shishwambana is not developed China. It is not cultivated, manicured fields. It does not look like photos of tea plantations in India. Driving into Yiwu, you have deep jungle on all sides. There are very venomous snakes everywhere, including in the road. You walk into the forest and you think you're in I mean, these villages are pretty small, right? One village that we were in has 12 houses, 12 families, but funjia, so the families then have kids now, and then it's called splitting the family. So there's now like, 20 something houses, but
The big fat Greek wedding, you have your house right
yeah,
there.
right next, yeah, exactly. So that's what's going on, but it's 12 families. And other are smaller than that. There's villages that are down to 6 or 8 families now.
And we were talking before about how a lot of these places don't even have paved road access or dirt road access.
Yes, yeah, still the case. And into the forest, they don't at all. Usually what you'll see is someone riding like a dirt bike style motorbike in the pickers. And is that good? Is that bad? It's probably fine to getting, they need to carry the tea a long way and get back to the production facility faster is probably a good thing. But I mean, our very first day walking into the forest to go see some deep forest tea, and there's this, I joke, Pat doesn't like snakes. He's on the editorial team. Frequent listeners of the podcast will know Pat for sure. Pat doesn't like snakes, and I'm joking, Pat,
Indiana Jones.
Yeah, and like, Pat, you keep a lookout for snakes. You're gonna step on a snake. He literally turns around to say, "Stop joking" at me, and goes, "Jason," and points between my legs. There is a snake slithering away, and I caught a photo of it too. It's in the trip report, and that was a small one. You're walking through these forests and there's birds chirping, and you turn a corner and suddenly all you hear is the sound of bees everywhere, wild jungle honey bees. And then you walk another 25 meters, 30 meters, and the bees sounds have died down. And now you have a different set of birds and different set of insects. You're on the border of Laos, and we drove to get to some of these more remote tea areas to go see some of the better, still more natural environment. And got in the car and drove 4.5 hours on dirt road each way. And we don't normally get car sick. I don't normally get car sick. That was one of the very few times I was starting to feel a little queasy. I guess drink, nothing but gallons of tea for 3 days and get in a 4.5 hour.
And a good amount of corn whiskey, I would imagine, as well, which doubled on my last trip to Yunnan, doubled as a tick killing agent.
Oh, you just rubbed it onto yourself?
This is what we did after we got out of the forest. We just rubbed it all over ourselves and smelled like a bar for the rest of the day. The forestry term for what you're describing is old growth forest, or, forest that has not had human intervention for the history of its existence. And I think it's hard for Americans to really appreciate what that means, because almost all of our old growth forest is gone. The redwoods are one of the last large swaths of old growth forest that we had, and I think only 5% of their native territory is still old growth. And what makes old growth forests interesting to foresters is that at every layer of the canopy, there's different life going on. There's life in the soil. There's plants growing at every stage of elevation from the ground to, way up in the air. And it's just an astounding level of biodiversity and complex plant relationships. And these have meaningful differences for the ways the plants grow. There are, I think, on the western half of the country, there are Douglas fir and maple forests. I might be getting the exact conifers wrong, but that the Douglas firs send sugars to the maples during the wintertime when the Douglas firs still have their leaves, the maples don't. And then in the summer, when the maples outshade the Douglas firs, they're sending sugars through their roots and mycelial networks back to feed conifers, and they have a mutualistic relationship this way. And this is a very long preamble of mine to ask you, what does that kind of growing environment do for the quality of the tea, and why is it such a special thing?
Yeah. So certainly Yiwu has that, and that's why people care about Gushu tea. That's why they care about forest tea. One of the things that we really got read into in a way was that not all Gushu is made equal. Particularly in the West, we're used to thinking, okay, this is Gushu tea, this is not Gushu tea. But actually, Gushu is often just the starting place in Yiwu, right? You have your village tea, you have your forest tea, you have your deep forest tea, you have your mid-mountain deep forest tea, you have your east slope, north slope, and south slope, east slope and west slope. All right, north slope is generally, you want afternoon sun versus morning sun, right? Stomatas stay closed longer, tea stays shaded longer. So there's all sorts of effects, but the predominant effects, having a natural, healthy environment like that, having a primary growth forest like that, an old growth forest like that, it means that the biodiversity there is naturally balanced away from the needs to use fertilizers and pesticides. So Yiwu tea, it's not to say that there is no Yiwu tea that uses tilled land and fertilizer and pesticides. There's actually, believe it or not, up on the mountain, there is an old growth Gushu plantation. There is a plantation where the trees are approximately 100 years old.
I love that for them.
Yeah, it's a small plantation, right? This is not, 1,000 acres.
Well, there are tea bushes in Darjeeling that are now at this point 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. And these are Daya cultivar trees. They're not doing anything too weird. It's just a group got together and planted a bunch of tea in a nicer environment, right? That did mean that they had to remove a bunch of the forest. Is that tea, despite being now Gushu, ever going to be as good as deep forest tea? Probably not. I can almost certainly say definitely not. And partially it's because once you do that, once you start monocropping, you're going to need to use fertilizers and pesticides. And the place where I find this to be most jolting is Wuyi for yancha. So we started talking about conversations of tea on the internet. One day we'll circle all the way back around to this. But one of my bugaboos, one of the things, is people drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, on mythical, magical places that are good because of the name. And Wuyi has a lot of that. Yancha has a lot of that. So my trip report from last year, which was not super positive on Wuyi, talked a lot about the use of fertilizers and pesticides, the use of monocropping, the intensive tea agriculture. And I got a lot of less than positive responses on the internet. Who could have imagined?
Tea world, never.
Negativity in online internet tea. And for better or for worse, I compared this to Wudong. I compared it to a place that I think really does an amazing job of caring for they call it Laocong, old growth tea. Damsong tea, those trees are easily as old as many harvested pu'er trees now. You have trees that are 300 plus years old that are still growing, still being harvested, are still in good health. And it's a place that does quite a bit to take care of its ecology and its land. Is it perfect? Is every area within Fenghuang great? Of course not. But if you compare that, but there was all this pushback online about how can you compare Wudong and Fenghuang to Wuyi, right? The environment's not as rich and the soil's not as rich and there's not the flowing water, it's okay. But
And this is where, how do you know? How do you know what this is doing for the land and for the chemistry of the tea plants? What are you basing this on?
what's your references? How many years have you spent researching this? But but part of the problem is if you ask someone that, they might say, "Oh, I've been drinking tea, I've been studying tea for 15 years, 20 years." But I hope that readers or listeners can see from the types of books that the editorial team and I have been writing that when we go somewhere to do this type of research, it means something quite different than having an enjoyable vacation in a tea mountain. That the type of work that we're doing is, we hope, novel research. Even the most recent trip report is 20, 30 something pages and 20 something citations in English and Chinese about agricultural density and monocropping practices. The soil has been so depleted in Wuyi that they have been importing soil since the late Qing dynasty and a process called teacup.
That's incredible.
And they've been bringing in soil from other areas of the park into this mythical, magical area. Okay. If you are bringing in foreign soil and you are adding fertilizer to that soil
And you're using non-native cultivars
of tea, right? Then can we really be talking about the depth and care for the land? And, the thing that I'm sure someone will read, hopefully someone will read the trip report, but the types of comments on the internet were things like, "Oh, I tried a loud song once and it didn't impress me."
That's a great data point you have there. Now go collect 10 more so you can actually do something with it.
Yeah. And honestly, I wish I could respond that, well, go try, go taste more. But the problem is that, particularly in somewhere like Wuyi, even more so than Yiwu, than pu'er, is in Yancha, you can't. In Yancha, telling someone to go out and taste more is they're going to get more of the same. If there was ever a tea region that was close to impossible to buy from, close to impossible to get the real thing because of mythologizing and merchant aggrandizement and exaggeration and secondhand information, it's we. And so you can go out and you can get a loud song, and that loud song might be in tilled soil full of fertilizer, or it might be next to a field that's tilled soil full of fertilizer, or it might be directly downslope where the water runs, right? Or it might be all of the above. But Wuyi, unlike Yiwu, is such a limited and constrained area, and there is no more land available. The government satellite monitors and has walkers that go out. You're not allowed to plant a single tree more. So the only thing that you can do is increase yield. And when you pull up the old trees, you're allowed to plant new trees. And particularly if you're going from an older style, something that loud song would have had a wider spacing, it would have been a larger trunk girth, it would have been single tree per hole likely. And so when you rip that up, you can plant 4 rogueway trees for every loud song native variety, and then you can goose it with tons of fertilizer. It's going to be more productive in its first 2 to 5 years.
You had a great photo in that earlier Wuyi trip report of this one tea bush that had just been pruned back until it looked like a tumbleweed. It was just full of tiny, thin twigs, and half of them looked dead. In my other life, I practiced bonsai, and looking at that tree, this was a tree that looked weak and like it was going to fail. When you keep pruning things back that way, you're activating epicormic buds that are not going to form as strong branch unions with the main trunk as the original buds. You're getting a lot of weak growth. You're eliminating any airflow within the plant so that you're making it more susceptible to disease. And the plant is now, instead of producing maybe 30 apical buds that are the top shoots, it's producing maybe 90 of them. And that flavor is going to get diluted through that great, like it's literally getting watered down by trying to increase yield that way. So it's fascinating to hear that they're not even necessarily using the soil from the famed mineral cliff area to grow the famous mineral cliff tea. So, I want to ask you about is, going back to these questions of appellations, there are regions that are very famous for whatever reason. If you're someone just looking to drink good tea and you're not after learning something specific about a place, what are you looking for in terms of growing environment, and how does that relate to these famous growing regions?
Yeah. I would say don't buy Wuyi tea. That's the case. And that it's an unfortunate thing to say, right? It's one of the most famous types of tea. It's one of the most mythical and advocated for teas. And when you get the real thing, it is phenomenal. But you pay $4 a gram for the fake thing, and it's hard to tell without references. So I would say don't do that. On the other hand, generally leveling up through pu'er is quite an efficient ladder. And you don't have to feel super bad about buying a little too much pu'er and samples, right? It's not like green tea, which is going to go off and, you open the bag and 2 weeks later, this is already dead. With pu'er, you can buy samples. Most people many merchants break up cakes and you can taste. And there's enough information out there and there's enough okay information out there that I would feel comfortable saying if you level up your ability to taste and explore in the pu'er world, that's one of the most diverse yet constrained types of tea where, if you ignore the claims for a 1,000-year Chawangshu ancient tree kind of stuff and just stick to, okay, here's Gushu, here's better Gushu, here's aged Gushu, and you level up in that way and you start to explore and understand what you like, I would say that's the most efficient path. Certainly not the only path. Taiwanese tea also offers a great sequence. Other forms of tea are harder to get or more seasonal. It's hard to level up in drinking green tea. You have about a month a year to really hone in on it. So yeah, my top recommendation is pu'er.
And how much should someone pay attention to specific regional claims? Or this is from deep Yiwu versus more outskirts, or this is maybe tea that would be sold as Yiwu, but it's from a less famous area, so they're changing the name of the. I guess what I'm curious about is how are you squaring growing environment versus region?
Yeah, 99% of the time you don't know. If you trust your merchant, you trust who you're buying it from, and they say this is a cleaner, naturaler environment, just take all statements like that and make them relative. Say versus everything else on their website. And you'll have a pretty good idea, right? Is that 100% accurate? Is it 100% true? Is it 100%, or do they know, or are they just repeating what they were told? Depends. But generally in where someone says, okay, this is small tree, but this is ecological small tree from a nice area. And they say, this is Gushu and this is deeper forest Gushu. It at least gives you some relative set of information. But the thing that I tell everyone, including very advanced tea practitioners, when we drink teas together, is don't over-index. Just because you've tasted 1 or 2 or 3 Gushu Mahe doesn't mean you have a clear idea of what Gushu Mahe should taste like, right? Listen, focus on the flavor, focus on the qualities, and then re-rank later, right? But to taste each tea singularly, and you'll be better served. Because when you start to over-index on your references, try to do comparative tastings in your head, compare every tea to the last tea that you had, to the last tea from that area that you have, it makes it much harder to learn from better teas, right? A lot of what makes great tea great is subtlety and non-obvious attributes. One of the things that I think really shines from this tea, not being a Gushu tea and being inexpertly made by me, is that there's no throat clench, right? The swallow is incredibly smooth. The soup and the feeling of the tea is very warming, is very calming. It doesn't make you hungry. It doesn't churn your stomach. And think about how many brews we've been going on this tea from this year, right? With no real astringency, little bit of verdantness in this Yisheng. This first time I'm pairing this Yisheng with it, probably a little young for this teapot. But that's a non-obvious attribute where most people who are new at tasting things focus on the obvious flavors first. And once you start to be able to taste past the brewer, the brewing skill, and taste past the where and the where skill, and really start to identify things that are unique and attributable to the tea as a quality or as a defect, and then you can start to develop a sense of what it is that you should be looking for in a specific area.
The common advice is when someone is trying to get into tea is sample widely, right? Get a bunch of samples, get a sense of what.
Yeah.
And I like that advice to an extent, but I try to urge people pretty early on, once you have a sense of what you like, take your time with even just one tea and focus on your experience with it
Yeah.
and drink it while you're in a rush. Drink it when you have some time to sit with it, and then drink it with friends and see
How
how
they
they
react.
respond to
Yeah.
it. Something that I think we bond over a lot is our more empirical approach to thinking and talking about tea. But the longer I drink tea, the more it feels like an Ichigo, Ichie sort of experience of it's going to be different every time, and it will have something to teach you every time. And it depends on how open you are to receiving that
To
information.
that experience. Yeah. I totally agree with that. I mean, one of the things that I constantly tell people is to drink tea with people who are more experienced than you. And for me, at this point, right, that means going to China and going to these places and really focusing in on a single tea. But for the readership of the books, we host the talk taste triage sessions, which are tasting sessions here in this tea room. And part of the idea is to allow people to either to bring samples of tea that they can't figure out what to do with, or they thought it was good and now they don't think it was good, or someone told them it was good and they can't figure out how to brew it, or tea wares for identification, using teapots and antiques or other whatever for identification. And that's one sequence. But the reason that I offer that is because the surest way to learn is to drink with people who are more experienced that can point out what it is that they're doing, what it is they're focusing on, and setting things up so that you can have these formative experiences where you can now have references for what is good. Very few people fall into naturally liking acquired tastes. And the joke about acquired taste, right, is you have to work to like it, right? It costs you money to acquire the preference. And it's true, but it was Pierre Bourdieu who said arts of the bourgeoisie will remain the arts of the bourgeois because they are the formative experiences to appreciate it, right? And it's almost a tautology that these preference ladders exist, right? Someone who drinks tea bags their entire life might truly have a real preference for the comfort and the flavor of Lipton or Yellow Label, Earl Grey, whatever it is. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's not what I like, right? But they haven't been through a preference ladder of going from there maybe into Sacha tea, into whole leaf tea, into Chinese tea, and specialty tea, into Gushu pu'er, right? And is there a preference ladder for that specific person? Probably. It might not end at Gushu pu'er, right? It might end on a higher end orthodox processing Indian tea. It might end at Taiwanese unroasted high mountain oolongs. But there is almost certainly a preference ladder out there that if someone had the right sequences of formative experiences, that they could acquire preferences that have more cultural capital and more social capital, and perhaps for better work, for worse, require more economic capital.
Something that I think is really interesting about tea is that it is something where there are good teas at all these different price points. You can spend 2 cents on a cup or $200 on a cup, and you have to adjust your parameters for what you're getting out of that experience. But there's such a diversity of the way tea is made around the world that you can find something within your budget that can still even be like a well-made thing. Once you get above the very bottom commercial
Yeah.
scale, you can find something that's decently made and from a decent environment that can scratch the itch that you're looking for. And that I think is something that he gets to play with more than some other commodities like wine or spirits or beer or coffee. There's I think a much greater span of quality. And we're talking about preference ladders, but it's not like you have to reach the top rung. There's no prize for detecting greater flavor.
At the highest end, usually prices become disconnected with quality. Highest end, it's frequently rarity and prestige and other things that are driving astronomical prices. I would not say that, is DRC, Domaine Romane Conti, worth its astronomical price when you could have, say, Chateau Lafite in its place or Clos de la Roche in its place? Probably not. No.
Yeah.
Someone else is buying I will be there. But, on my own budget, at that point, you're paying for rarity, you're paying for prestige. And certainly the same thing happens in tea, somewhat in pu'er and overwhelmingly in yancha.
So tea in the US is a niche pursuit, obviously. Specialty Chinese teas even more so. And for a lot of hobbyists that we interact with online, they don't really have anyone in person to drink tea with. And so all of that discourse moves online. How do you think that has shaped the way that tea is talked about among hobbyists here?
I think it lends itself to the online forum syndromes where people become defensive, either promotional or defensive about their preferences, about what they're drinking. And I mean, you see it on, I don't spend a huge amount of time on online tea forums or anything, particularly not the English language ones, Reddit, for example. But
You've leveled up.
no, I mean, I was just never a super online person. I ran my own WordPress blog. My books are on their own site. Never had social media. I don't have Instagram or Facebook. The Tea Technique Instagram is run by Pat, who messages Nancy, who messages, or messages me, forwards things along from time to time. So not a very online person, but I do come across it sometimes, or my editorial team points it out to me from time to time, what people are saying. And so much of it is either promotional. Again, Tea Technique has an Instagram. It promotes stuff. So it's not as if all promotion is bad. Your newsletter goes out to people, I receive it. I don't consider that to be overtly negative side promotional. But actually the point that I wanted to make was that you'll see it all the time. Beginner tea people on one of these forums saying, hey, I bought X because I was told X is good and now I tasted it and I think it's okay, but is it really good? And it's a request for, it's almost like fishing for compliments. But it's fishing for reassurance that they're drinking good stuff.
There are all these posts that are rate my cart of tea that I have just clicked order and it hasn't arrived, but I'm now starting to feel buyer's remorse and the need to be comforted.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with these individuals. I do want to make that clear, right? It's talking just about the discourse and the type of discourse. Those people feel that they need reassurance because they buy their thing and they go online and they're like, oh, I don't like brand X and I think brand Y is better and I tasted Z and it was good, it was bad, whatever it is. And so the reason that they're looking for the reassurance is because there's just so much negativity in the online tea world of people claiming guruship or claiming that they have the real stuff or the true flavor or the only source or that they know. You know what I mean? And look, Tea Technique has a very authoritative voice. It's the way that we write the books, almost textbook style. But we're very careful about not putting either explicitly stating when something is our own opinion or making sure that everything that we're writing is a factual claim. And we're clear when there's debates on things, just like when we were talking about the Yesheng versus not Yesheng. If you're someone who's buying and selling lots of Yesheng trees, you're going to have an opinion on how that should be framed. No, this is the good flavor. This is what the tea should taste like. And we're thankfully in a position where we can say some people like it, some people don't. There is debate on this, even amongst the makers there, even amongst top end collectors in China. There's no agreement on this. And my personal opinion is I have a non-explicit preference for it. I drink Yesheng tea. I also drink not Yesheng tea. One of the families that I work with does not do Yesheng tea. And when I say work with, I mean do the research with. One of the people we were making tea with. And it's one of my absolute best sources, one of the best sources for information and learning. It's a legacy family in Yiwu, now 3 generations of tea making. And so what am I going to do? Debate them? Say, I like this Yesheng tea, right? This, or tell everyone, no, you have to agree with this person because this person is the guru. This is where the good tea comes from. There are facts and there are myths, but then there's places where you can form your own opinion, and who you drink with and who you taste with and who you learn from counts for a lot of that. But there's a very long-winded response of saying that I think the tea hermitage, the Western tea hermits drinking alone and posting online often fall into a trap of either having a singular guru, right? And there's people online who cultivate this type of guruship, or falling into a hit and run I'm going to sample these things, I'm going to sample these things, without ever sitting down with someone who can explain where does this rank in the broader scheme of things, and what is it that you should be looking for, and why would people buy this?
Yeah, it's easy to disregard what you're saying as he's just gatekeeping knowledge, and he's just trying to say that you should only get information through sources from him. And I see this in so many different aspects of food and culture talk. And the grim reality is that knowledge is hard won. And the work that you and your team are doing requires so much legwork and so much personal relationship development. And then you're dealing with primary sources and dealing with historical artifacts to learn from them. And that's not a democratic pursuit that everyone can do.
No.
But you find your sources of knowledge where you can. And I think there's so much value in talking to a tea teacher in whatever way you want to take that. And you hear what they say and you just incorporate it into yourself without making it dogma. Yeah. And we talk a lot about what do we wish the tea community had to better guide it. How do you think we build something better? Obviously, you're trying to do it with tea technique, but what do you think is the way that we build a better educational and media environment for people to learn more about tea?
I appreciate what you said, and I hope that tea technique is as little gatekeeping as possible. We don't sell tea. We don't make recommendations on where to buy tea or wares.
And you show your work. You explain why X leads to Z.
Yeah, as much as is possible in across hundreds of pages are cited and thorough and documented, and we're open to debate. One of the things that I think really is distinct about tea technique, and actually talks about the media system, one of the only reasons that we even charge for the books is to keep the curated comment environment, to make the comment environment constructive and positive and questioning, and to allow people to question us. I just had a conversation with Taran in China who didn't like my count of the number of named peaks in Wuyi. So I had written 39, 39's on the high end. He said standard number is 36. And so I said, okay, let me take a quick look at this, because this was the core claim of this trip report. And turns out there is no easily citable number, right? China's government's UNESCO application lists 27. Okay, where did these other peaks come from? And you start going down a rabbit hole. So he's like, here's some sources from like the Fujian government regional WeChat accounts. Like, we can't use that because that's tourist information. So then we went down this path of explaining. So if we were to actually make a claim on the number of peaks, the way that I would have to go about this is I would need to go find at latest Ming and Qing dynasty travelogues. They need to collate the named peaks that they mentioned, cross-reference which ones are consistent and which ones are inconsistent across some period of time, and then group. And there were 400 plus monasteries that were in monasteries plus hermitages, religious sites that were in Wuyi. So then I would have to start listing those out and reference the geolocality and see if there was consistency in naming, or if there were variations in names across Buddhist, Taoist, Confucius sites, and then look at how those group together. So that would be the extent of what we would have to do to even make a claim on the number of named peaks as a citable source.
I don't understand why you just aren't asking ChatGPT.
It's a worthy challenge. And then you go into a cost benefit analysis, right? Does this make sense to make a citable claim in a trip report where, this is a weak claim. This is not something that was very important. So I put a note that common standard number ranges for the number of named peaks in Wuyi vary from 27 to 39. Most common number is 36. China's UNESCO application said 27, right? And that was the extent of what I was willing to make a claim on, given the information that I had. But that's the type of pushback that we want. We want people to be able to come to us and say, hey, I don't agree with this, or this isn't what I heard, and have a type of constructive conversation. How do we create a better tea ecosystem and a tea media environment? having places for friendly, constructive, thoughtful discussions and a real understanding of what it means that we're not just going to make up a number. There's plenty of places that you can go find a blog post that says a specific number. And if you wanted to go reference someone else's blog post, you can take part in the cytogenesis.
And if you want to look at topographical maps, you can go ahead and do. It's amazing the legs that this has. I've lost track of the number of dupes, but it just keeps delivering.
Yeah.
The semi-explicitly stated purpose of Leafhopper as a publication is that I want tea people or anyone who drinks tea to feel more confident as a buyer and as a consumer, that I want to give you the tools to help you make judgments for yourself about what tea is good for you, what good tea means, and where to find it. And I can't believe I'm going to bring this up on the internet, but in the Rian Johnson Star Wars movie, there's this beautiful scene between the ghost of Yoda and Luke Skywalker, where they're discussing training the next generation of adults. And Yoda has this beautiful line where he says, "We are what they grow beyond." And I think it's such an important mindset to have when you're writing about really anything where you're trying to be educational, when you're trying to teach or to provoke or to get people to ask questions. I think the internet rewards people who mythologize themselves. And there are characters in the tea world that we have discussed and in all sorts of other fields that have built themselves up as people who cannot be questioned and who you will never be able to gain the knowledge that they have. And to me, that's entirely backward about what the purpose of sharing information is, because the people that we speak to are so generous with sharing their insights with us. And the best thing I think I could hope for is for some Gen Alpha kid to read one of my pieces or is subscribed to the textbook and then produce something in 20 years that makes me seethingly jealous that I didn't think of doing that sort of thing. That's what we're working towards, is building people up.
One of the things that I'm very admittedly not good at is incubating a beginner community. Tea Technique is explicitly for advanced practitioners, someone who wants to read 800 plus pages on Yesheng teapots and soon probably a few thousand pages on pu'er. These aren't introductory texts. People jokingly call them textbooks. It's not far off of what they are. In China, often you drink tea at home, you drink tea around, you meet some people who are more into tea, you fall into a friend group, very much the same way that people in the United States get into wine or get into beer. If they're in a group of friends that really like craft beer, it's easy enough to get onto the preference ladder and suddenly you're buying $35 large format bottles of foeder aged beer. You're standing in line for 3-4 hours.
You've ruined your marriage. You've turned the basement into a home brewery. And
yeah, that's going a different direction. But yeah, the trick is to marry someone who likes wine, and you negotiate which bottles you're collecting versus drinking. We marked that one as 2025.
That's why you have to buy two.
Yeah. That one's not for next year.
The end bottle is just a sample.
Yeah.
The cake's the cake.
Cake is a sample. Yeah. A tongue is a purchase. I like that saying. I'm not against that saying, but talking about the rarity and to the extent that these things go, like I showed the loose leaf pressed tea. There are batches like that where that's all the tea, right? Particularly from Danju teas, right? They'll produce somewhere 500 to 800 grams. It doesn't even make sense to try to do a ton. You're not going to get stuff cakes. And so they just leave it loose and it makes it less likely to break stuff. And then you can give, one brew doses to all of your friends. I think the thing that is missing on that note is that ladder where instead of sitting at home and reading things on the internet and getting into a situation where you have developed unique preferences from drinking tea alone for a long time, let alone beer and wine. Those are not products to drink alone. There should be it would be optimal if there was a way for people to find a community, and from that community they can grow. And we have that in wine, right? You can fall into a wine group, and then your friends start taking the entry level quartermaster sommelier course to get first license. Everyone starts bringing bottles wrapped in tinfoil to restaurants. Everyone starts tasting blind, trying to guess at it. Half the group goes on to get second level license. Suddenly one of the guys has a career in wine, right? And then now suddenly you're in a wine crew, right?
And you're spending time with people over something that you all care about and
Yeah.
building a shared experience that has so much value
Yeah.
beyond just what you're drinking.
Exactly. Part of what makes tea amazing, part of what makes any of these products amazing is the rest of the cultural baggage that comes with it. And I mean that in the absolute best way. I got into tea. I didn't get into teapots. Now I'm writing a book about teapots. Admittedly, the book is a lot longer than I wanted it to be. I can't wait to start writing about tea again. But there was certainly a ladder there. I now know a lot more about Chinese history and Chinese culture, and have many more friends throughout China, both tea people and not tea people. The deeper appreciation of Chinese food and cultural variations, regional variations. I can hear the difference in accents and understand someone's cultural heritage to an extent. Are they from Guangzhou? Are they from city Guangdong? Are they from countryside Guangdong? Are they from deep Yunnan, living in a different world?
And I imagine all of that informs your tea drinking in all kinds of ways too. These are often considered sort of soft areas of knowledge. It's not, empirical necessarily, but it adds so much texture to understanding the context that this tea comes from.
Yeah, it does. There are foods and situations where you would drink certain wines, and there are foods and situations where you wouldn't. Right? It's the same. There's wares that you would use with some teas. There's cultural settings you do with some teas. There's some places where it's okay to whip out a thermos of tea and drink, and there's situations where it's not in China. And yeah, having that type of cultural touchstone as something that allows you to spiderweb out and understand so much more is one of the great joys of tea. And it's one of the things that I think is much harder to do in an isolated form.
Yeah, it really is a social beverage first. And I think even the way that one pot of tea makes many brews, the leaves are expansive. Everything about tea, I think, wants to be shared. Coffee doesn't seem to want to be brewed. Coffee seems to be so prone to error of all these different ways that you can mince it up. And you have to use so much mass to get a relatively small amount of juice, and you can't rebrew it once you've done it. It seems like we're really fighting it, whereas like the tea plant, it's almost like the corn that's domesticated us. The tea plant wants us to drink it or something. And I know that's not what the tea plant's actual evolutionary goal is, but give it a few thousand more years, who knows?
At this point, tea has been wildly successful being planted and consumed by humans. There are many more tea plants in the world than there would be otherwise. I know we've kind of veered around on topics. One of the things that I really appreciate about Leafhopper is the ability to bring people in. You write it in a way that even if someone doesn't know anything about the tea that you're writing about, or the country, or the origin that you're writing about, it's very well written to bring people into the writing. It very quickly and efficiently gives them enough context that they get an idea, and they get a correct idea, but they also get enough context to then go and either purchase a tea or taste a tea or try what it is that you recommended. And I think that type of writing is very different than what I do at Tea Technique, but it's also very different than what I think I see anywhere else. And much closer to wine writing, there's not that many beer writers anymore, but much closer to wine writing.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. And that's very much the goal. I think the gold standard for any kind of writing is that it should be interesting to someone, even if they have no innate interest in the subject matter. And Sports Illustrated, before it got devoured by private equity, was a great example of this, where there was an incredible history of journalism in Sports Illustrated. I have no interest in sports really whatsoever, but good stories are good stories. And something that writers are often taught is you find the universal in the specific, where this is a vehicle for exploring something that is true about itself, but also reveals something more about life on Earth. And it's increasingly hard to find places where that kind of writing can exist because it takes time to develop it. And every once in a while, young kids from college email me and say, I want to get into food media. How would I go about doing it? And I love talking to anyone who wants it. I'm very happy to share whatever from my life would be helpful. But I tell them candidly, I don't know where you could go to start publishing where you can develop your craft and work with someone who's going to help you refine your ideas and help you find the universal and the specific, because all of those entry level publications that had things for like a short event listing or 100-word blurb about a book, those don't really exist anymore. Both there are fewer publications now and there were fewer opportunities for writers to write within them. So I feel in some ways like I kind of caught the last chopper out of Nam in terms of getting real mentorship from writers who could, exactly what you were talking about with tea, people that are better than you at something, who can help you develop your sense of taste so that you know what to look for, so you know what to create. And in the same way that tea needs this continuity of education, good writing and good communication needs that exact same kind of lineage. And it doesn't take long. You really only need to lose about 2 generations of people in writing and farming for a huge amount of knowledge to just disappear. And that really scares me as we're getting into an age where you can't tell if what you were reading on the internet was from a human being, or whether it was designed as engagement bait to sell you something. You just don't know. And I feel that the self-reliance that we're both in our own ways trying to help cultivate in our audience is the best antidote to that sort of thing. You have to be able to trust your gut about what you're seeing in order to find people that are going to point you in the right direction about things.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe turn around a little of the negativity.
Maybe make it not a competition. And remember that this is supposed to be something that we enjoy and that brings us pleasure and that allows us to learn from our fellow human beings. And why does that have to be a competitive zero-sum type of experience?
Yeah. Yeah. Because someone gets known as the tea guy in their circle, and then, they find out that the world's a whole lot bigger than they thought. And identities get wrapped into ego.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I think one of the greatest human experiences out there is realizing that you don't know shit and that there is a whole new world of things for you to learn about. And this is how I feel every time I read an entry from a tea technique, because I don't know shit, especially with teaware. It's incredible. So tea technique people know a bit about your setup. You have this incredibly intricate setup of tea and pots where you're soaking the pots in water beforehand and you're warming them by hand to temper them up so that they don't get shocked. Where does it end for you, I guess? What does reaching the top of the preference ladder for you mean?
Yeah. Let me answer that question in a different way. And let's switch teas. I know we've been going for a while. So this tea, I thought, is just a beautiful example of what a deep forest tea, you mentioned that more mustardy, the more vegetal note. It was a little bit from the thicker Juni. This is a Jiaodong Juni teapot. It's actually aged Juni clay, but it is contemporary production. This is the very first commission the tea technique did as we were writing the Yesheng book. And it was based on a design that we used to have at the Tea Institute of Penn State from the 90s that was a little bit smaller in Hongni. And I just love the wide mouth. You can just swallow a chunk of tea. And when we designed this teapot, we actually assumed that it was going to be predominantly an oolong pot, but it just does wonders with so many different teas, very accentuating, very highlighting. We've been using it a lot with younger to mid-aged sheng. This sheng I thought was just a little too young for this tea, but I thought that particularly in the later brews and its longevity, it got into much more of that sweet floral that Yiwu is known for. Incredibly smooth. It never developed any bitterness or astringency. Not a good or bad thing, just that's what Yiwu is highly known for. And the leaves themselves are huge. If you wanted to add anything to that idea.
Yeah, huge, robust. I think your business co-founder was asking me the last time I was here, what are you looking for when you're paying a pipe of these? And I was trying to say, you want to see one like
Cuticle test.
Yeah, that they can still hold together.
And make sure that the cuticle doesn't shred after brewing, when you rub it between your fingers.
Yeah, that it doesn't just break apart into fibers. It still has that. It's a testament to the skill of being able to heavily, because you're withering something and rolling it for hours and cooking it and then pressing it, or not in this case, but and then brewing it, and then it's still able to look at the end like a leaf. That's an extraordinary thing that tea leaves can do.
Yeah, to be processed in the hot wok and then brewed in boiling water 20 times and then hold itself together. But it's a sign of forest tea. You're not going to do that with plantation tea, or certainly not with CTC tea. And then the next tea that I wanted to move to is another specialty. This one I did not make, thankfully. I think one tea of my own processing per day, a week, per month.
You'll go back every year and you'll start doing a vertical series of your own teas and see how you're progressing as you.
From your lips to God's ears. This is 2015 Mansa. This is a Gushu. This is much deeper forest Gushu. Has a bit of age on it, obviously. And Mansa region, which is, it's interesting. Mansa kind of avoided some of the hype chain. It's not Guafangjai, but it's one of the older regions. I mean, Guafangjai and those outer region pu'ers had a difficult time producing. They had great trees, they had great land, very natural environment. It was much further from the road. It's still quite difficult to get there. But because the tea was all such deep forest, it frequently got a little too withered, a little bruised. They didn't have electricity for a long time. The tea got smoky. There's all sorts of things. So this idea of, okay, we had these amazing trees and this not less than amazing production right up until 2005, 2006 or so, when it started and just went crazy. From there,
I mean, with that, the production got more refined of how they were handling the leaves.
Yes, the production got more refined. There was more attention paid to it. Basically everyone was using cooking woks, family cooking woks. I mean, people think, oh, the tea is so sensitive, you have to keep it free of aromas and have to make sure that the wares are clean. You're only going to use one Yesheng for one tea. And meanwhile, in Yunnan, up until 2010 in a lot of places, or the early 2000s in other places in more core central locations, but in the outer regions without electricity up until 2006 or so, like, they were using family cooking wok. You're
Yesterday's pork belly, today's Gushu.
Yeah, today's Gushu and tonight's chicken. All right, it was the family cooking wok, and it was flat, and you had to lean all the way over it. And it wasn't until more recently that they have the slanted woks with the standing position and chimneys that blow the smoke away from the tea. But Mansa is more of a historical production area. It was one of the older production areas. It was actually one of the core regions of Yiwu until the village burned down, and then it moved to Yiwu town. And Mansa has consistently made great tea. And so this 2015 deeper forest Gushu, it is deep forest. It's not the deepest forest, not days into the forest. But I'm happy to share this. And that teapot was a contemporary teapot. And if you want to take a smell, describe for listeners.
I'm very bad with describing the aroma of dried tea leaves. And I find like funky forest teas, I think, especially resist neat flavor descriptions because they're less like the things that we're obsessively handling and breeding like dogs to have specifically. I get a very nice foresty impression, a bit of funk that smells very nice, and this like lovely hay aroma. And the leaves look very different from the Yiwu tea that we were drinking before. Is that because of different plant genetics or different plucking standards?
Probably close to the same plucking standards. Yeah, probably pretty close to the same plucking standards. This tea is deeper forest than the other tea. So the stems are generally going to be a little longer. They're going to be a little thicker. Leaves are going to have a little more of that pointy curve shape to them. This tea is older. There's 10 years of age on it. So it's darkened. And this was also, of course, pressed into a cake where the other tea was never pressed. So that accounts for a lot of it. The things that I would look for in a tea like this, something labeled Mansa, is going to be that type of high line florality, a really faint florality, and a type of either honey or brown sugar is indicative notes of Yiwu. And particularly for something like this, finding that type of sweet floral as a high note that remains 10 years in is a very good indicator of quality.
There's a lot of debate over how well is it going to age? Is it good if it doesn't age well? Where do you stand on that question of will it age? Because we're drinking young tea. We're drinking tea that you could call maybe beginning to be aged at the 10-year mark. How much does this matter to you in your drinking?
It matters when making purchases to think through, am I going to put this away or am I going to drink? One thing I've become a lot more comfortable with in just the last few years, particularly writing the books and having way too much tea, is just not consistently saving things for special occasion, thinking I'm going to drink this later, I'm going to drink this later, and putting that type of thing off. It becomes really easy to do, and you realize, why am I only drinking the lowest end teas in my collection? And so I do make a point of going through and drinking teas. But also, the nice thing about pu'er is you're buying a cake or two cakes or a tong. And so you can taste over time. You can determine if things are accelerating in the wrong direction. You can increase the amount of consumption of it. But it's very hard to know in advance, is something going to age? I had tea that was at my family home in Miami, which you would think would be hot and humid, except actually Miami's air conditioned everywhere. So I had humidifiers in a humidor, not quite as nice as this one. And, then I went off to Penn State and that tea stayed there for close to 9 years. So a bunch of early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s tea just got aged for 9-10 years. And on schedule, my mother would go and add water to the humidifiers. And I finally recovered all of that tea here and started drinking it. And wow, that aged well. Not all of it, not every single cake, but so much of it. Take that and put it away for 10 years. But, this is 90s, early 2000s, where majority of that's Meng tea. Some people do say that Meng tea ages better, it ages in the type of humidified environment better. So the other thing that's happened, particularly on this trip, drinking so much young Shang, being in Yiwu during harvest season, is that young Yiwu tea is amazing. And I have no qualms about drinking it. Great deep forest, Gaogan Gushu, less than a year old, it's fine. It's good. What do I need to sit on it for? Then he's left in 10 years, I'll still be enjoying it probably. But as for this idea of will it age and will it age into what you want it to, I think a lot of people have very warped ideas about what that type of aging does, depending on where the tea is from and how processing methods have changed over time. A lot of people point to this idea of factory tea as the tea that's going to age best, the tea that'll do best in aging. But, I think it's a pretty warped idea. That tea is made, it's processed in a specific style. And it's a style that some people will say means that it ages more, it ages faster, it ages better. The only thing that the people in Yiwu who actually produce tea for the factories are willing to say is that it's processed in a way that the flavor change is more obvious earlier. That's what they want to say. They are willing to confirm it is Gushu tea. There is real Gushu in a lot of the higher end factory teas. It's not like they're saying this tea is no good, but it is a very specific style of processing that is not the style that they're doing for their boutique productions.
And it's to give customers, I imagine, a sense of confidence that, yes, this tea is changing and that change will be good, so that it's noticeable somehow.
These are communist era factories that developed practices that have now been enshrined into expectations. So maybe there was a real reason for it then, maybe not, but now it aligns with the expectation. You buy, 7542, and you expect that in the first 5 years, you're going to be able to taste the flavor differences of the 7542. It's going to start to develop what people think of as aged notes. Are those age notes? There are certainly notes that come from the tea getting older, right? Is it what you would consider to be optimal aging? I think some of the cult now around factory teas is also driven by guruhood and personal preference. But there's good factory tea and there's good boutique tea.
I think there's also a sense of greater authenticity around something that is, that the boutique stuff maybe feels a little too Western and a little too achy, whereas, there are factories that have history and involvement with the history of the communist revolution within China. And they're the teas that the grandpas might be drinking in people's eyes. And when you were describing the changes in production styles for areas like matcha, where they switched from using the kitchen wok to a tea wok and they were venting out the smoke, it raises such an interesting issue for ideas of authenticity,
Yeah.
of what authentic,
What
in
is
the
authentic?
manner should taste like.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see this question of authenticity evolve as the pu'er industry in particular is professionalizing and
Gaining an understanding of what it is. I mean, ideas of authenticity in pu'er are so fraught. Zheng Jinghong, of course, did the best book on it.
of course,
And she's just a wonderful individual. But chasing this idea of authenticity or what's authentic, wine doesn't taste like what it tasted like pre-1900s. Champagne doesn't taste like what it tasted like in 1700s, 1800s, right? Things change for sometimes good reasons, sometimes bad reasons. But there's going to be historical progression, stylistic progressions in these places. And so if you can take a product that is, highly ideoculture driven, terroir driven product and create incentives to care for the land, to increase qualities of production, to cultivate things that are indigenous and unique and special about a reason, right? That's the surest type authenticity, even if it's not immediately obvious as historical authenticity. This dried meadow flowers and brown sugar.
there's a sweet manure note that I find very pleasant in that, in the most positive way, that like an almost like ambergris kind of ripeness to it. That's very satisfying and surprising for something that's only 10 years old.
Yeah. And the teapot it's paired with, because we're on a conversation that's branched now a couple hundred times. This teapot is a Qing Dynasty Zini, and this teapot acts like a magnifying glass. This teapot is actually shockingly difficult to use because it has such a strong concentration effect. Most teapots will have either some haloing and some rounding, or be more rounding. Very few teapots very few Yishengs act as pure magnifying glasses. And to find one like this that pairs so well with so many different teas that was a fun one.
And this isn't even just about the type of clay or the shape. These are gradations of quality so specific and subtle that making generalizations about the type of clay that it is doesn't even begin to scratch the surface.
No, not at all. Yeah, this type of Qing Dynasty Zini is not the kind of thing that's going to have an easily referenceable name you can get a modern version of. So you had asked about the setup and the end goals. So the kettle is to being a lot of high skill level tea practitioners, if I may include myself in that category, have switched to using tetsu beans for many tea. They do an amazing job of adding lightness and sweetness to the water. And if you care for them, they're basically indestructible. The water is New York tap. New York tap is amazing, but you do need to let some chlorine and other things blow off. So all of the water gets boiled once, put into a ongi aging jar. That's more of a Korean tradition. There's a slight tradition. It's known about water aging in China. It's not done all that much, but in Korea, they strongly believe in water aging. And this is a specialized jar for water aging. So the water gets aged here with activated bamboo charcoal, and it goes back into the tetsu for boiling and brewing tea. And then different wares, different cups for different teas, different teapots. The one thing that I do say that we are very, I don't know, maybe different than other tea groups is that we are part of the No Patina Club. We do not promote the idea of cha shan or patina buildup either on the outside of the teapot or on the inside of the teapot. So I will use this for this mid-aged Sheng pu'er today, and I might use it for Taiwanese high mountain oolong tomorrow, and I might use it for yan cha immediately after that. I'll clean the teapot, keep it cleaned.
There's that old chestnut about if you brew a tea enough times, you can then steep just plain water in there and get tea. And that is such a disgusting thing to think about. Do you want all that oxidized oil, polymerized, just stuff like that? That's a gross mug that you've never washed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
is that seasoning your office coffee mug?
If Yisheng is a magical clay that has unique attributes that transform the tea inside of it, then covering that clay with a patina is certainly not the route to magic. But, I only bring that up because you asked about like the end game. And so, anytime that I think I'm done or close to done, something new, something different comes along. So, the number of teapots here has far proliferated in writing the book. I have more teapots than I would like. I do switch kettles depending on the type of tea that we're brewing. We were discussing earlier that, I asked in advance what type of tea, because instead of a tetsu bean, if we had decided to drink yancha, I would have used shadiao. But anytime that you think that you've reached end game, it's likely that there's something more. Just this time in Wuyi, I got invited to drink some secret tea in a secret area, is the nicest way to say it. And this was god tier tea. This was not in the scenic area. It was in the Nine Bend Nature Preserve, far less developed and well known, much more strict ecological standards. So this was actually Laocong tea in a degraded older dansha environment at a higher altitude, but still plenty of flowing water. And this was something that is the type of experience that you have that resets your scale on what's actually possible within a category. And these experiences have become they become rare over time. It's easy to become jaded. So you're talking about analytical tastings and the way that we have these very empirical approach to tea. And in some ways that's good. It's good for us. It's good to learn. It's good to be able to then write about. But in so many other ways, it is intellectualizing all of your experiences, distances you from what originally drew you into the experiences. And so I wrote up this blog post. For people who don't know, I have two different publications. I have the books, which is where the formal writing, the good writing, team of editors, research, citations, etc. I have Cult of Quality, which is where I put all my hot takes and trip reports.
So the liner notes.
It's where all my controversial takes.
The Jason Cohen After Dark special edition extras on the DVD.
Yeah, that's what gets all of the response and chatter. I wish people would just message me directly about it instead of talking about the posts on a forum.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people feel like they're punching up at some highfalutin authority, as if either of us are, like we're just two guys, who the hell are we? What you're talking about, there's a lot of similar trajectories in bonsai world where there's a common trajectory where people, and I went through this too, where you start out, you kill your first few trees, learning what you're doing, and then you start collecting and you're buying a bunch of different trees of different species and at different stages of development. And interesting.
Yeah, totally awakened.
Yeah, very almost like very somber, but really nice. And there's value in that because you can only do so much work on a tree at a given time. And so it helps to develop your skills if you have more trees to work on. And then you wind up with 200, 300 trees. And there are people that their whole backyards just become full of bonsai trees.
That's
and then
a lot of trees.
And then you have a whole watering protocol that you're not allowed to travel anywhere because
you have to water.
That's and then you build out the whole drip irrigation thing. And then there's this phenomenon where a lot of people start selling a lot of their trees and giving away. And they just focus on
they get a couple and they
and then when you sell a tree to somebody, they might hack off all the branches and totally restyle it after you've spent, years or decades shaping it into this one form of sculpture. Somebody else could look at it and completely,
Decide.
and completely reshape it. And there's a lot of, there's an idea that the tree outlives you and that you don't own it. You're its steward.
Yeah.
You're passing it on to the next generation. And it's interesting to watch their collections expand and contract. Oftentimes as people get older, they'll switch to focusing on much smaller trees because it's just easier for them to handle. And I don't know, reminds me that there's different things for you at different seasons of your life. Maybe there's time when you want to really intellectualize everything. And then there's a time when you've done some of that work and you're ready to just live some of it.
Yeah. Drink the tea, drink the collection. Don't save it for a rainy day.
Yeah. I'm curious, for someone so obsessive like yourself, where this is your passion project, what do you think that looks like for you in 10, 20 years?
Good question. Keep joking about which books we're going to write. To your point, the blog post that I was referring to is based around the Buddhist saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And it's a strange saying, but part of the idea is seeking out, even at this level of practice, being able to go and seek out experiences that rip you from the intellectual back into that sense of wow and discovery. All right, being able to think, okay, I've had a lot of experiences and this is going to be a good experience. And I'm going to learn from this experience, and then just being walloped in a wave of wow, right? And being unable to take your notes, being unable to intellectualize because you're so taken with an experience. And those become more rare as you become more experienced. You lose that beginner mind. When people talk about things like beginner mind, it's often about keeping that sense of wonder and what keeps you going and motivated. And for me, having those experiences, not super regularly, but maybe more regularly than people would expect because of the type of research and experiential work that we do. So I had that experience in Yiwu, or had that experience in Wuyi. Honestly, might be having that experience right now. I haven't put this tea in this teapot before. I thought we would do some.
Yeah, I'm feeling like both of our attentions are gravitating more towards the teapot right now.
Yeah, having a little bit of an effect. It feels like a weighted blanket is wrapped around me. And I updosed this a little bit too, because I figured, we needed some energy to keep the conversation going. But yeah, what does that look like? I don't know. I hope at some point, I mean, I live in New York City, and like everyone else who lives here, you think maybe one day you'll actually be able to buy a place. And if you can, and carving out enough space to have a tea room, even bigger and grander than the spot we're sitting in right now. I mean, so much depends on the unknowns of life. I would love to have a continuous, permanent tea space like this, but even more permanent, even more built, that can welcome people to continue learning. And I think, the teapot collection has expanded too much to write these books, and it's going to continue to expand to write these books. And then at some point, I think it will shrink again. There's teapots that they don't use very often.
You'll do a great auction sale fundraiser.
Something.
It'll be a great windfall for the next generation of tea drinkers.
Yeah, something like that, I hope, and bequeath it to, an organization or something that can keep things going. But what does it look like? One of the most impactful things that I think that I've done in tea world is the Tea Institute at Penn State, which trained at this point probably somewhere between 100 and 150-ish or so real charan who went out into the world. Some of whom who remain close and friends, but many of whom who I only knew 2 generations distant when I was at that point just an advisor, when I had already left Penn State. And those generations continue to go on and drink tea and go out there and do interesting things. And part of what was so impactful about that is having that intense, focused culture that we were talking about earlier. People coming, being at the tea house at all times of day. You walk into the tea house, you'd be like, I'm going to have a quiet bowl of tea at 11:30 p.m. because you're studying or something, because it's a university, right? And you walk in and there's 6 people there doing a brew off, right? Everyone brewing the same type of tea and evaluating each other's cups and, and then your study plans go out the window, but you are learning something and redeveloping something like that. It's hard to do something like exactly like that outside of a college environment, but being able to have a dedicated, consistent group where it's not one person necessarily in charge there all the time, but the type of place where people are gathering and focused discussion.
And where it's not one teacher disseminating, but nodes all interacting with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe there's, some informal ranking, or maybe there's some formal ranking based on things. The Institute had a ranking system. You had the students who hadn't passed into the Institute, who didn't have open access to anything, had to be there with someone or weren't allowed in at certain hours. Then you had your Institute members and basic sets of research. And then you had your lineage heads, people who had taken on teaching roles, who had been nominated as skilled enough to go and teach the uninitiated. And then you had your officers who had various responsibilities, and, and then you had your more senior researchers, and, and then you had people capable of teaching what we call masterclass, which was the continuing education for the most advanced sets of practitioners, which like towards the end of my tenure was the only thing. It was really my only involvement. I showed up and did the late evening master classes, but it was still multimodal, right? There was multiple people teaching and there was multiple disagreements. One of the most teachable moments was when two different lineage heads disagreed about something, critique each other in front of their students, and evolved into brouhaha or debates, right? Or getting other external opinions from other institute members.
Yeah, that's beautiful to even within one school, you're not insisting on a specific dogma of ideology. You're allowing people to be pluralistic and seeing what happens when those perspectives come to head. This is something that Sebastian from In Pursuit of Tea and I talk about a lot. For those who don't know, I also do some work with In Pursuit of Tea, doing content for their newsletter, etc. The value of getting producers from different parts of the tea world talking to each other and just exchanging ideas, because they're dealing with totally different contexts and they rarely get the chance to talk shop with similarly obsessive weirdos from a totally different place, and what opportunities for cultural exchange could exist there. And one would think that trade shows provide a forum for that, but they really don't. And maybe tea houses like what you're describing could be a place where that sort of thing happens. I'm envisioning residency series where producers from different areas could come and brew their tea and talk about it, and have roundtables of like different Orthodox tea producers or different pu'er tea producers from different regions, and they could all say the other one's is shit.
Yeah, they can side snipe at each other. Yeah, or and having that type of space in a semi-commercial or non-commercial, almost a clubhouse-like environment, if there was a way to do that and keep it to be, that would be that's my late career end goal. But the joke now is every time a topic comes up, one of the editors says, "Oh, we'll write a book about that." But yeah, the current plan is finish the Yesheng book, begin publication of the pu'er book. The pu'er book will probably be so long, we'll probably publish other books in between.
This is classic deep writer condition. This is why George R.R. Martin will never complete that book trilogy, that book series. But that's the process of doing reporting and research. It takes the time that it takes.
Yeah. Yeah. These, I get the Bene Gesserit, our plans are measured in centuries. I mean, we announced that we're going to start doing the research for the pu'er book. The research is expected to take 3 to 5 years before we officially start writing. And then the publication calendar will probably be 3 to 5 years of serialization. And so we'll probably write, this is all off the cuff estimates, but we'll probably wind up writing a book on tasting tea and a book on experiments, how to construct tasting experiments, how to go about deciding I'm going to pair this tea with this teapot in these cups or these things, intervals during the serialization of the much longer pu'er book.
Something it's interesting that you bring up the Bene Gesserit, because something that I really wish I could ask some of those generations of Reverend Mothers, where the plan is measured in centuries, and then right before the finish line, someone falls in love and just like screws the whole thing up. And what I want to ask them is, if you knew this outcome, if you knew the teleology, if you knew you would never reach what you were teleologically moving towards, would it still be worth it for you? And I think my closing question to you is going to be, if you don't reach that point, how does this research feel along the way of what you're doing right now, being where you are?
I mean, as long as the books continue to get published, I'm going to be happy. You know, there's so much work and trials and tribulations, A fun and B fun, that goes into writing the books. Whether or not we ever get wind up with a tea space and the clubhouse and a local, you know, so far we have a small local group. You've been to some of the talk taste triage events. But whether we ever get into an institutionalized form of that, I don't know. I would love to, but does it need to be much more than what we're currently doing for me to be happy? No, no more so than the way that some other things would make me happy. A case of DRC, and so
yeah, you're throwing a rare tea, and then just close up shop and just run.
Yeah,
leave the internet forever.
Yeah, but you know
That's amazing.
Yeah.
There's this interesting bitterness with a total absence of astringency that is very pleasing to me, that has this kind of medicinal core that, like the huidan is immediate. There's sweetness at first, and then it just keeps building. But like that kind of funky, almost like sinister foresty note that
creeps in.
Yeah, it really has a personality to it that I could try to put it into tasting notes, but yeah, really it feels like I'm getting to know someone by drinking this tea.
Yeah. I mean, this tea is not Yesheng variety. This is totally non-wild tea cultivar tea. It is Daya, it is Gushu, but this type of deep forest flavor, the type of mossy notes, really only comes from the type of symbiotic, heavily shaded plants. And the feeling of this tea, the other tea was excellent tea. I do love that tea. But, you know, going from that tea, which was quite comfortable, and we said warming, right, to this tea, which feels like you are just being rolled in a weighted blanket and it's dripping you from the inside. And people say tea drunk, but this is a little bit on a different level of that.
Yeah, this is, you feel it in your bones. It goes all the way down to your feet, and it's comfortable in the way that, you know, like when you're really sick and just every part of you aches and you are able to finally get back into bed and it's like you just melt into the mattress. That's the impression that I get from drinking this.
My somewhat last question, my series of last questions for you is we could end on hot takes.
Good call.
Yeah. This is something the editorial team used to do this back in the first book. The first book had many more, I don't know, opinions, cultural references, but the Yixing book is a little not drier, but there's less things to have hot takes on. So I was hoping to bring this one back so we can do hot takes.
Or do you want some parameters or just whatever's off the dome?
No, we can just go back and forth on this. So I'll start with you. Tatami seating, hot take. Pro, con, dislike.
I'm one of those Philistines that really loves a seat with a back. I love to, you know, do some Passover style of reclining on a pillow, manishtana. I love when I'm drinking tea at home, I'm nestled in a deep couch, and that's because I have bad posture, and that's just some how things have shaken out. But the vibe and the tactile feeling of being on a tatami is a really special thing. And I think it's very contextual.
Yeah, well, the reason for the tatami is specifically to break fellow Americans, Westerners, out of their routine. No shoes, have to sit on the floor, have to sit on the tatami, kind of a constrained space. And the idea is, you know, obviously not super traditional Chinese, but the idea is to break people out of the norm. People are more receptive of understanding, you know, that we're doing something special when seemingly so, in my experience, sitting on the tatami.
I like that as almost, it's a portal of you're entering a different kind of place.
Yeah.
And you're going to be engaging in a different kind of consciousness. All right, let's see a hot take question for you. Ethically sourced.
I don't even know what it means. Ethically sourcing to me is going to origin, meeting the makers. I mean, am I willing to believe that some of the trade organizations that are doing ethically sourced work are good or better? Maybe, but I think it's these types of things are prone to regulatory capture the same way that only the largest farms willing to make the investment get organic certification. And so you have non-organic farms that have more organic practices than organic farms. And the joke in organic is it's not that you're not allowed to use pesticides. It's you're not allowed to use any pesticides that work. So I have some skepticism, and I would say the only ethical trade, the only fair ethical trade is direct trade. If you're not face to face with the farmer or the maker, I'm not saying, obviously you can't do that for every tea, for every wine, for every beer, for whatever, anything. And I certainly do not do so here. But my best teas and my best collections are all from direct interaction, purchases, and relationship building, which is what gives you access to the things that are not really sold in a market.
And obviously a complete and thorough audit of how they treat every single person that works for them, with pay stubs of what they're being paid, and an analysis of all the living conditions of any migrant pickers.
Yeah. The pickers we don't get to interview all that often, but most of the team family winds up being, this is my first cousin, this is my second cousin, this is my nephew, my second nephew.
Yeah. And you make sure that no one's getting beaten behind the scenes, that the family dynamics are all smooth. It's a really sticky wicket to try and pin down.
Okay. Hot take. Yisheng, Gaiwan, both, either, neither.
I don't have the patience to get into that level of tea where I am drinking mostly with glazed wares of varying kinds. Usually it's based on how much tea am I looking to drink right now, or how expensive is a given tea, and do I need to be wary about portion sizes. I think these are pieces of ceramic art that are best consumed as ceramic art. As in, if you like the look, you should buy a teapot because you like the way it looks and you want to use it and you want to handle it and brew with it. If you're trying to chase specific benefits, I think you better know a whole lot about that thing before you start trying to say this exact pot should be used for this exact thing.
No one knows.
And if that matters to you so much, why not just get some really good clay, hammer it to pieces, throw all the pieces in a thermos, and then just use that to condition your tea?
So I guess that hot take is also no wood-fired wares or specialty tea ware.
I love wood-fired ceramics. This is almost like some sun-dried tomato there. Interesting. I think wood-fired ceramics are beautiful. I think I know a decent amount about tea. My sensitivity isn't anywhere near as calibrated as yours in terms of being able to make these distinctions. And for me, I'm pretty comfortable with where I am in terms of teaware. It's just not
where you want to focus.
Yeah. I have other ceramic vices that also
compete for,
that also factor in. But it's a great thing to realize you don't know shit and to have experiences with something that get to teach you something new. So I don't begrudge anyone who wants to pursue that path. But for me personally, it's just not the way I think that I have been most relating to tea. Let's see. Pu'er supremacy versus other teas, where it's all just leading up to pu'er.
Yeah, people say that about pu'er or about yancha. Those are the two that mostly get it. The thing about pu'er is that I could buy a lot of it and not feel bad. I could buy it and I could leave it in Miami for 10 years and come back. So I had more pu'er than I have any other tea because of that, because I don't have to worry about when or if or how I'm going to drink it. What is my personal end game tea? I think the entire tea technique team has just become Chaozhou Densong obsessives. We've all just fallen head over heels in love with Densong. It's a really esoteric tea. It's esoteric in China. It's, talk about a tea that's gatekeeping because it's just not that common or that popular. And then it has all sorts of crazy distinctions, and it doesn't have the level of information that's available even for something when Wuyi has all this hype and all this myth and all of this promotion, but at least you have some idea like, okay, it's these cultivars and these things, right? If you can find anything other than Milanshang for Dansong, and the real Dansong, all the real Dansong is all single tree. And so, you never get, nearly impossible to get great single tree teas because they don't really split them into samples or batches. You have to buy and mostly an entire harvest, one picking of the tree. So there's all these things that makes it really difficult. But when it's there, when it's good, Dansong might be my end game tea.
Mellifluous in a way that no other teas quite reach.
Yeah. And just, it's a tea that's made to be enjoyed. And the way they drink it in Chaozhou is so wildly endearing. People put 12 grams of like wildly rare tea, and you'll have guys who are smoking a cigarette, brewing 12 grams of single tree tea, and just going. And but the culture in Chaozhou is there. People are literally sitting there with 3 Nilu burning all the pit charcoal with shadiao on, doing one boil for one brew in Chaozhou teapots this big, brewing super concentrated Chouzhou Gongfu style. And it's not like a show. It's not like they're doing this. They're sitting alone, right? And,
Yeah.
like they're living the
culture.
They're living the culture. And yeah, I think Dansong might be my end game tea.
A very respectable answer. And yeah, if I had, there aren't a lot of things that make me wish I worked more to get more money, but being able to afford a good job would be
yeah. It hasn't hit Wuyi hype prices yet, but the good stuff is still a couple dollars per gram now. So it's gotten up there. Okay, last round. Tea drinking habits. You wrote in Leafhopper, I think just the other day, that you don't start drinking tea till 6 or 7 p.m.
Yeah. So what the fuck is wrong with me? Is that
I guess that's the hot take. What?
So I'm really not a morning person. I thrive in that 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. witching hour zone. That's when I feel most creative. That's when the world is quiet and I can feel most alive.
Is that when you do your writing?
I used to do it when I had an office day job. Yeah, my best writing was done at night. My habits have sort of shifted since working freelance, but I'm not a morning person. And because I get to work freelance, my mornings start more in the afternoon. So part of it is just that my day is chronologically shifted to a different time zone. But tea for me has become a reprieve from the end of the day. I can sit with myself and I have no other obligations. No one's going to bother me. And that is when drinking tea feels most pleasing to me and sort of most restorative to me. And this isn't a hard rule. I will, if I'm cold brewing something, I'll drink that throughout the day. Or if I am meeting with someone earlier and they want to have some tea, I'll brew some tea for us. And on the weekends, that goes out the window. On the weekends, tea drinking is much more of an all afternoon affair. But caffeine doesn't really do much for me in terms of actually waking me up to be like, it doesn't have much of a functional spike in that way. So, and it doesn't seem to interfere that much with me being able to go to sleep. So knock on wood, that will continue to be true. And the context that I wrote about it on Leafhopper was the way that the afternoon tea break was engineered by the factory owner class in England, when you have this perfect storm of tea and sugar becoming very affordable at the same time. And you have this growing factory labor environment where you have a labor force that needs to be in at 8, out at 8, and they have to be energized and efficient throughout that whole system. And nutrition's really bad. So sweetened caffeinated tea that they can drink quickly is a way to sort of keep them in line. And the tea break is a way to sort of make it seem like a perk, even though, and not to dismiss the social connection values that happen during off the tea breaks, but that this is something that the man created in order to get more juice out of their workers. And I like thinking about tea as not something to be productivity juice, but to be something that helps me relax. I'm often also pairing tea with some cannabis, which I keep to an evening sort of thing. My dream is to do, as soon as I can find someone to cover the liability of this, is to do a tea and cannabis experience, tasting something to get people thinking about chachi in a way that might make sense to them, and trying to pair different strains with different upper and downer teas to see how that could open people's minds. But
so you're not that far off from the Chow grandpas. But
that really, I think, that's the end game, is to be, that's my end game, is regardless of what I'm actually drinking, is to be the grandpa with a good spliff, and ideally like a little folding table out on some Queens Street where we can just like
active charcoal, Nilu.
And just sit and sip and bitch and watch the world go by. That I think is like peak New York character behavior that I aspire to someday.
Our writing habits couldn't be more different. I historically wasn't super much a morning person. I forced myself to become a morning person during the pandemic when locked in this tea room and writing the first book. And I have a non-writing job. So what I do is I wake up first thing in the morning, first alarm, no snooze, and it's immediately tetsubin on the boil, write the book, first thing, full tea, usually only one tea during that. And I can usually get in anywhere from, on a bad day, 15, 25, 30 minutes of writing. Frequently that happens when research gets involved and then becomes more reading and note-taking than writing. And sometimes, no morning meetings. I can get, 2 hours of writing done, burn through a chapter, and that's it. And if I deviate from that at all, I get absolutely no writing done. If I look at my email, if I get distracted by something, if I go from very focused, specific topic research and like spirals into something else, I get no writing done at all.
This sounds like the much healthier way of doing things. Mentally, physically.
I'm not sure. And then and then I drink tea straight through the day, usually somewhere between, 3 teas a day. Sometimes, particularly if, I have external meetings and stuff and go for coffee or something, then just 2, and sometimes on days that starts long 4. But usually I stop drinking tea around 5 or 6. I don't really like mixing tea with alcohol or with food. So usually 5, 6 p.m. is usually cutoff time. Although when I'm in China, they definitely don't do that. We'll drink tea throughout the entire day, go for dinner, drinks at dinner, and then more tea, then maybe back out to drinks. And then,
for people who haven't experienced that, it's such a marathon of caffeine and alcohol and just pacing yourself so that you survive it by the end.
No, alcohol is my vice. Tea doesn't count as a vice, but alcohol is my vice. I think that comes through in some of the writings, particularly the last couple of trip reports. I've used wine as a side-by-side, as a comparison product for tea.
And you have antique glassware that you talk about the same way that you talk about antique teaware in terms of weight of it and the way that it's interacting with what's served inside. And that's an aspect of wine and spirits drinking that I think most wine and spirits people don't even get into that often.
No, in antique glassware, no. I blame tea for doing that to me, just kind of you get into it somewhere and then it creeps into everything you're doing.
That's what's beautiful about it, right? Yeah. This insidious thing that just gets itself into every little aspect of our life.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you for having me on.
This is
Great
amazing.
conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. I think the next publication will be a chapter discussion after a couple of these bonus episodes. So, cheers.
So long.